Under a quiet European field, where farmers now walk without a second thought, something heavy still presses against the earth, just a few feet below their boots. A shape of iron and history that should have disappeared 3 centuries ago, but never did. And what looks like nothing more than uneven ground is actually the top of a forgotten cannon, buried so deep in time that even the wars it once shaped have been reduced to names in books. And yet beneath that soil, the story is not silent. It is waiting. Most people walking across these old battlefields today would never imagine that beneath the grass lies an entire layer of early modern warfare frozen in place. Cannons abandoned not because they were useless, but because they were too heavy, too costly, and too dangerous to recover after the fighting stopped. And what remains beneath Europe is not just metal, but evidence of how war itself transformed between the 1500s and 1800s. This was the era when cannons first broke the dominance of stone walls and armored cavalry, when entire cities began to fall not through prolonged siege alone, but through the relentless pressure of expanding firepower that reshaped how nations fought and survived. Yet the truth that rarely gets told is how many of these weapons never left the battlefield they helped destroy. In countless forgotten conflicts stretching across France, Germany, Spain, and the lowlands, artillery crews pushed their equipment beyond what was sustainable, dragging bronze and iron barrels through mud, rain, and smoke, only to abandon them when the front lines shifted, or when recovery became impossible under the weight of logistics that early modern armies could barely manage. What we now find beneath these fields are not museum pieces placed for display, but relics locked in the exact positions where chaos ended, sometimes tilted at unnatural angles, sometimes shattered from internal pressure, and sometimes still pointing toward places that no longer exist in any meaningful form above ground. The brutal truth behind these cannons is not just that they were powerful, but that they were disposable in a way modern warfare rarely acknowledges, treated as tools of advantage in the moment and forgotten the instant they stopped serving a purpose. Left behind as armies moved on to the next campaign, the next siege, the next border dispute that would again reshape the map of Europe. Archaeologists today uncover them slowly, layer by layer, as if the earth itself had been deliberately preserving evidence of a forgotten engineering arms race. And each discovery reveals something more unsettling than the last, not because of what these weapons were capable of, but because of how casually they were discarded in the aftermath of destruction. And as we begin to piece together where these cannons came from, why they were left behind, and what they reveal about the early transformation of warfare, a deeper question starts to emerge beneath the soil of Europe, one that history never fully answers on the surface. Because the real story of these cannons is not about their firepower at all, but about what it meant for entire generations to build instruments of war so massive that even their disappearance became part of the battlefield itself, a truth still buried, waiting just beneath the ground. As the layers of soil continue to reveal these forgotten cannons, the story begins to shift from simple remnants of war into something far more complex. Because what lies beneath Europe is not a single battlefield, but a stacked archive of centuries of conflict, each layer pressed into the ground by the weight of armies that once believed they were shaping history permanently, and yet left behind more than they ever intended to preserve. In the early modern period between the 16th century and the 18th century, warfare across Europe was undergoing a transformation that most people at the time could barely comprehend. As kingdoms expanded their use of gunpowder artillery and slowly replaced older forms of siege warfare with new methods of breaking fortified cities through sustained bombardment and coordinated infantry pressure. But what is often overlooked is how quickly this new technology outpaced the ability of armies to maintain it in the field. Cannons were not simple weapons that could be moved effortlessly from one engagement to another. They were massive engineered systems requiring specialized crews, horses, supply chains, and maintenance that stretched the limits of what early logistics could support, meaning that every campaign carried within it the risk of leaving behind pieces of its own firepower. In many cases, after prolonged sieges or rapid advances, commanders were forced into decisions that prioritized survival and mobility over recovery, leaving heavy artillery embedded in terrain that was never designed to reclaim it. Over time, these abandoned weapons became part of the landscape itself, slowly sinking into marshes, fields, and the foundations of destroyed fortifications, not as artifacts intentionally preserved, but as casualties of logistical exhaustion. The evolution of cannon design during this period also contributed to this outcome, as improvements in size and destructive capability often came at the cost of portability, creating weapons so heavy that once they were positioned for a siege, they were rarely moved again unless absolutely necessary. Entire armies would advance with the expectation that their artillery would remain in place for weeks or months, only to abandon sections of it when weather, enemy resistance, or supply breakdowns made retrieval impossible. This pattern repeated across multiple conflicts, from the shifting borders of the Holy Roman Empire to the long campaigns between France and its rivals, embedding layers of military hardware beneath landscapes that would later become peaceful farmland and quiet villages. What makes these buried cannons so significant is not only their physical presence, but what they reveal about the nature of early modern warfare itself. A system where technological progress often created more weight than mobility, and where the very tools designed to dominate battlefields were also among the first to be sacrificed when conditions deteriorated. Modern examinations of these sites show that many cannons remain exactly where they were last deployed, angled toward positions that no longer exist, surrounded by soil that has slowly reclaimed every trace of the armies that once operated them. This creates a form of historical stratification, where each recovered object acts as a timestamp, marking not just a moment of conflict, but a moment of abandonment, when the momentum of war outpaced the ability to sustain it. As more of these sites are uncovered, a clearer picture emerges of how deeply intertwined destruction and disposal were in shaping the military history of Europe, and how the physical remnants left behind were never meant to be found again, yet continue to surface centuries later as silent evidence of how fragile even the most powerful weapons of their time truly were. As the buried cannons continue to surface through layers of soil and forgotten fortifications, a deeper pattern begins to emerge that goes beyond technology or logistics, revealing a hidden structure of how early modern European warfare actually expanded and collapsed in real time. Because each recovered piece is not isolated, but part of a wider system of movement, abandonment, and rediscovery that stretched across centuries of shifting borders and repeated campaigns. During the 16th century and continuing into the 18th century, European states were locked in constant cycles of territorial competition, where wars were not single events, but prolonged sequences of sieges, withdrawals, and re-engagements that often spanned years, forcing armies to operate in environments where permanence was impossible and mobility dictated survival. In this context, artillery units became both the most powerful and the most vulnerable components of any military force. Because while cannons could determine the outcome of a siege or defensive stand, they also required an entire infrastructure of transport wagons, horses, trained operators, and maintenance crews that could collapse instantly under strain. When campaigns extended beyond expected durations, or when supply routes were disrupted by weather or enemy interference, commanders were frequently forced to make irreversible decisions about equipment, prioritizing the continuation of movement over the recovery of heavy assets that could no longer be supported. Over time, this created a repeating historical pattern in which cannons were positioned, used, and then left behind in place, not as planned disposals, but as consequences of shifting operational reality. What makes this period particularly significant is that artillery technology was advancing faster than the systems built to sustain it, meaning that every improvement in firepower often introduced new logistical burdens that early modern administrations struggled to fully anticipate. As cannons grew larger and more effective in breaching fortified walls, they also became less adaptable, often requiring stable firing positions that anchored them to specific locations for extended periods, turning battlefields into semi-permanent industrial zones of war production and destruction. In many cases, once a siege concluded or once strategic objectives shifted, these positions were simply abandoned in place, leaving behind structured arrangements of artillery that no longer had a functional purpose, but remained physically embedded in the terrain. Over decades and centuries, natural processes such as soil accumulation, vegetation growth, and landscape reconstruction gradually concealed these remnants, transforming active instruments of warfare into geological artifacts. Yet beneath this transformation, the spatial logic of their original deployment still exists, and modern recovery efforts often reveal consistent patterns in how these cannons were arranged, suggesting standardized military doctrines that govern their placement across different regions and conflicts. This consistency provides insight into how early modern commanders thought about battlefield control, treating artillery not as isolated weapons, but as part of coordinated networks designed to dominate space through overlapping fields of fire. As these networks dissolved at the end of conflicts, what remained was not chaos, but a frozen blueprint of military intention, preserved unintentionally beneath layers of earth. Each discovery today does more than confirm the existence of past battles. It reconstructs the operational mindset of armies that viewed terrain as something to be shaped and held temporarily, rather than permanently occupied. In this way, the buried cannons of Europe are not simply remnants of forgotten wars, but structural evidence of a long historical transition in which warfare became increasingly dependent on systems that were powerful in execution, but fragile in continuity, leaving behind physical traces that continue to surface long after the strategies that created them have disappeared. As the investigation into these buried cannons deepens, another layer of understanding begins to surface, shifting the focus from battlefield logistics and military structure toward the human systems that surrounded these weapons and ultimately determined their fate. Early modern European armies between the 16th and 18th centuries were not permanent professional structures in the modern sense, but rather evolving organizations built on shifting alliances, temporary contracts, and rapidly changing command hierarchies that often dissolved as quickly as they formed. This instability meant that artillery units, despite their immense strategic value, were frequently subject to reorganization, reassignment, or complete abandonment, depending on the political and financial conditions of each campaign. When a campaign ended, or when a commander lost authority, the administrative continuity required to recover heavy equipment like cannons often collapsed entirely, leaving these weapons embedded in the last positions where coordinated control still existed. In many regions across Europe, particularly in contested borderlands where control shifted repeatedly between rival states, this resulted in overlapping layers of military infrastructure that were never fully cleared, as each new campaign built upon the remnants of the previous one without fully removing what came before. Over time, this created a form of historical layering beneath the ground, where different eras of warfare exist stacked upon each other, each defined by its own technology, strategy, and material footprint. Cannons from earlier campaigns were often left untouched, not because they were forgotten in the conventional sense, but because recovering them required resources and stability that post-conflict environments rarely provided. In the absence of centralized recovery systems, local terrain became the default storage for military equipment that no longer had immediate utility, effectively turning fields, riverbanks, and forest edges into unintentional archives of war. As centuries passed, these sites were gradually absorbed into civilian landscapes, with agriculture, urban expansion, and natural erosion concealing the underlying structure of their military past. Yet despite this transformation, modern analysis of recovered cannons reveals a remarkable consistency in how these weapons were distributed and abandoned, suggesting that even in the chaos of early modern warfare, there were underlying patterns of organization that governed how armies deployed and ultimately left behind their artillery. These patterns indicate that abandonment was not random, but often followed the logical boundaries of operational zones, where supply lines ended and command authority weakened, marking invisible lines across the landscape that defined the limits of sustained military presence. In this sense, each cannon discovered today serves as a fixed point in a much larger map of historical movement, representing not only where armies fought, but also where they lost the ability to continue functioning as cohesive systems. The significance of these findings extends beyond archaeology, because they reveal how deeply the mechanics of early modern warfare were tied to impermanence, where even the most powerful instruments of destruction were subject to the same instability as the political structures that deployed them. What emerges from this perspective is a portrait of warfare defined not by singular moments of conflict, but by continuous cycles of formation and dissolution, where material assets like cannons were both symbols of power and casualties of systemic breakdown. As more of these buried sites are uncovered across Europe, they continue to challenge the assumption that history is fully preserved in archives and written records, demonstrating instead that some of its most important evidence remains physically embedded beneath the surface, waiting to be interpreted through the intersection of material discovery and historical reconstruction. As the investigation moves beyond the structural and logistical patterns behind these buried cannons, the focus shifts toward the actual moments in which these weapons were actively reshaping the landscape of early modern Europe, not through isolated events, but through continuous pressure applied across decades of evolving warfare between the 16th and 18th centuries. During this period, European conflict was defined less by decisive single battles and more by prolonged campaigns, in which entire regions were subjected to repeated cycles of fortification, bombardment, and reconstruction, creating environments where artillery became the central mechanism of territorial control. Cannons were not merely instruments placed on a battlefield, they were strategic anchors that determined how long a siege could be sustained and how quickly a fortified position could collapse under sustained pressure. As a result, commanders increasingly structured their operations around the deployment of artillery batteries, positioning them in ways that maximized coverage of key defensive points, while simultaneously exposing them to environmental and operational risks that often exceeded their long-term survivability. In many cases, the effectiveness of these weapons was directly tied to their immobility once deployed, meaning that the longer a siege continued, the more likely it became that these systems would remain embedded in place long after their tactical purpose had ended. This created a historical paradox in which the most influential tools of warfare were also the least likely to be recovered once their immediate function had been fulfilled. Over time, this led to the accumulation of abandoned artillery positions across Europe, particularly in regions where repeated military campaigns passed through the same strategic corridors, leaving behind a dense network of forgotten installations that gradually merged into the natural environment. These sites often contained multiple generations of artillery placement, where newer cannons were positioned alongside or even above the remnants of older systems, creating a layered record of shifting military priorities that can still be traced through modern excavation. The presence of these layered sites suggests that early modern warfare was not only dynamic in motion, but also accumulative in its physical footprint, continuously building upon its own remains without fully erasing what came before. As armies moved on to new objectives, the abandoned cannons became static witnesses to transitions in power, marking the points where military momentum slowed and logistical limitations overtook strategic ambition. In this context, each recovered cannon represents not just a weapon, but a fixed point in a broader continuum of conflict, capturing the moment when operational control ended and the material consequences of warfare were left behind. Modern analysis of these locations reveals that many of them align with historical supply routes, siege lines, and defensive perimeters, indicating that the placement and abandonment of artillery was deeply integrated into the broader spatial logic of early modern military planning. This reinforces the idea that these cannons were never truly isolated objects, but components of a larger system that extended far beyond the battlefield itself, connecting logistics, engineering, and geography into a single operational framework. What emerges from this understanding is a more complex picture of early modern warfare, one in which the physical remnants left beneath the ground are not random artifacts, but structured evidence of how entire campaigns were organized, executed, and ultimately dissolved, leaving behind a material record that continues to surface long after the original conflicts have faded from memory. As the pattern of abandoned artillery sites becomes clearer through both excavation and historical reconstruction, the narrative shifts into the final layer of understanding, where the focus is no longer only on how these cannons were deployed or abandoned, but on what their long-term presence reveals about the relationship between technology, environment, and historical memory in early modern Europe between the 16th and 18th centuries. One of the most significant insights emerging from these discoveries is that the physical landscape of Europe was not simply a passive stage for warfare, but an active participant in shaping how conflict unfolded and how its remnants were preserved. Rivers, valleys, forests, and plains all influenced the placement of artillery, but they also determined the likelihood of recovery after campaigns ended, with certain terrains naturally preserving heavy equipment, while others gradually absorbed it beyond visibility. Over centuries, this interaction between geography and military activity created zones where historical material accumulated in concentrated layers, effectively turning specific regions into long-term repositories of conflict history without any intentional design. As researchers examine these areas, they consistently find that cannons are often positioned in relation to natural movement corridors, such as river crossings, trade routes, and elevation lines that were originally chosen for tactical advantage, but later became the exact locations where abandoned equipment remained trapped once military operations ceased. This suggests that early modern warfare left behind not only artifacts, but also a permanent imprint on the spatial organization of the continent, where even peaceful modern landscapes still carry the structural memory of past military logic. In addition to environmental factors, the economic realities of early modern states played a critical role in determining why so much artillery was never recovered. Maintaining, transporting, and repositioning cannons required substantial financial and logistical resources that were often unavailable after campaigns ended, especially in regions where prolonged wars drained state treasuries and disrupted administrative systems. As a result, military planners frequently accepted the loss of heavy equipment as an unavoidable cost of operations, prioritizing future campaigns over the recovery of material already embedded in contested terrain. This pragmatic approach contributed directly to the accumulation of abandoned artillery sites, reinforcing a cycle in which warfare generated its own physical residue faster than it could be systematically cleared. Over time, these decisions created a fragmented but persistent archaeological record that reflects not only the intensity of conflict, but also the limitations of early modern governance. When modern excavation teams recover these cannons today, they are not simply retrieving isolated objects, but reconstructing entire operational environments that once existed in a state of constant flux, where decisions were made under pressure and often without the possibility of reversal. Each discovery provides evidence of how early modern societies balanced technological innovation with material constraint, revealing that the advancement of artillery was inseparable from the accumulation of its physical remains across the continent. In this way, the buried cannons of Europe serve as a continuous reminder that historical progress is not linear or cleanly resolved, but layered, uneven, and permanently inscribed into the ground itself, where the remnants of past systems continue to shape how the present understands its own origins. As the study of Europe's buried artillery sites reaches a more integrated understanding, attention shifts from isolated discoveries and environmental preservation to the broader transformation of how early modern societies experienced time, memory, and material consequence between the 16th and 18th centuries. Unlike modern military systems, where equipment is tracked, cataloged, and systematically recovered, early modern European warfare operated within a fragmented administrative reality in which record-keeping, battlefield control, and logistical recovery were unevenly developed across different states and regions. This meant that once a campaign ended or a front collapsed, the material remnants of war often entered a state of historical suspension, neither actively used nor formally recovered, but instead left in place until natural forces or later development gradually obscured them. Over decades and centuries, this process created a silent accumulation of military artifacts embedded within civilian landscapes, where the physical remnants of past conflicts became indistinguishable from the geography itself. What makes this phenomenon particularly significant is that it reveals how early modern warfare extended far beyond the duration of active campaigns, continuing to exist materially long after political resolutions had been declared. In this sense, the buried cannons of Europe function as long-term indicators of unresolved logistical limits, marking the boundaries of what early modern states could realistically control and retrieve. As modern research continues to map these sites, a consistent pattern emerges in which areas of repeated military activity correspond directly with zones of dense archaeological recovery, suggesting that centuries of conflict effectively engineered an invisible infrastructure beneath the continent. This infrastructure was not planned or intentional, but emerged organically from repeated cycles of deployment and abandonment, forming a spatial archive of warfare that has persisted without interruption since its creation. Each recovered cannon adds to this archive, not as an isolated object, but as part of a continuous chain of operational decisions that shaped how war was conducted, sustained, and ultimately left behind. The significance of this chain lies in its ability to reveal the limits of early modern state capacity, particularly in relation to the management of large-scale technological systems under conditions of prolonged conflict. Cannons represented one of the most advanced military technologies of their time, yet their deployment exposed the fragility of the systems required to support them, especially when campaigns extended beyond initial expectations, or when multiple theaters of war demanded simultaneous resource allocation. In such circumstances, the recovery of heavy artillery became a secondary concern, often deferred indefinitely as states prioritized immediate strategic survival over material reclamation. Over time, this pragmatic abandonment became normalized, embedding itself into the operational logic of warfare across Europe. The result was a continent where the physical remnants of past conflicts were not anomalies, but expected outcomes, gradually absorbed into the land and forgotten by successive generations who inherited landscapes already shaped by earlier wars. Modern interpretation of these findings continues to refine our understanding of how deeply material conditions influenced historical outcomes, demonstrating that the evolution of warfare was not only a story of technological innovation, but also of persistent constraint, where even the most powerful instruments of destruction were ultimately governed by the limits of mobility, recovery, and endurance within early modern systems of conflict. As the accumulated evidence from Europe's buried artillery sites continues to expand through modern excavation and historical reconstruction, the narrative reaches a point where the focus shifts from the physical and logistical dimensions of early modern warfare toward its long-term cultural and interpretive consequences between the 16th and 18th centuries, revealing how deeply these forgotten remnants have influenced the way modern societies understand their own past. Over time, the presence of cannons embedded within civilian landscapes has gradually altered the relationship between history and geography, creating environments where the boundaries between lived space and historical record are no longer clearly separated. Fields, riverbanks, and forest edges that appear entirely ordinary on the surface are now understood, through archaeological verification, to contain structured layers of military activity that span multiple centuries, each layer representing a distinct phase of conflict, abandonment, and natural reintegration. This transformation has led to a broader reassessment of how historical memory is constructed, particularly in relation to early modern warfare, where written records alone are insufficient to capture the full scope of material persistence left behind by repeated military campaigns. As researchers continue to integrate physical discoveries with archival sources, it becomes increasingly clear that many assumptions about the finality of historical events are incomplete, because the material consequences of those events continue to exist in hidden form beneath the surface. The cannons recovered from these sites function as tangible anchors, linking present-day observation with past operational realities, allowing historians to reconstruct not only the sequence of events, but also the spatial and logistical frameworks that govern them. In doing so, they reveal that early modern warfare was not a closed chapter in history, but an ongoing physical process that extended far beyond the cessation of active conflict. This perspective fundamentally changes how the legacy of European military history is interpreted, shifting it from a narrative of concluded wars to a continuous interaction between human systems and the environments they repeatedly transform. The gradual emergence of these artifacts also highlights the limitations of historical visibility, demonstrating that what is recorded in official accounts represents only a fraction of what physically occurred, while much of the material reality remained unrecorded, buried, and slowly absorbed into the land over time. In this context, each discovered cannon becomes more than an object of study. It becomes a point of convergence between documented history and material evidence, offering insight into how early modern societies organized, sustained, and ultimately left behind the instruments of their own conflicts. As modern technology continues to improve the ability to detect and analyze these buried structures, the scope of this hidden historical layer expands further, suggesting that significant portions of Europe's military past remain physically present beneath contemporary landscapes. This ongoing process of discovery continues to refine the understanding of how warfare shaped not only political boundaries and historical outcomes, but also the very ground beneath modern civilization, embedding its legacy in a form that persists independently of written memory and continues to surface gradually through the work of archaeological investigation. As the full scope of Europe's buried artillery continues to expand through ongoing archaeological discovery and historical synthesis, the narrative reaches its final layer, where the focus shifts from what has been uncovered to what remains fundamentally unknown, and from what can be reconstructed to what may never be fully explained within the limits of surviving evidence. Across the landscapes of Europe, from open fields in western regions to forested valleys and river basins in central territories, the persistent discovery of early modern cannons between the 16th and 18th centuries continues to challenge the assumption that historical processes conclude neatly once recorded in official accounts. Instead, what emerges is a more unsettling understanding that large portions of the material past exist in a state of partial visibility, where evidence surfaces intermittently without ever forming a complete or final picture. Each cannon recovered adds clarity to a specific moment in history, yet simultaneously deepens the awareness that countless other artifacts remain undiscovered, still embedded within layers of soil that have never been systematically examined. This creates a historical framework defined not by completion, but by continuous incompleteness, where every answer generates additional questions about scale, distribution, and forgotten context. In this sense, the buried artillery of Europe represents not a closed chapter of military development, but an open system of historical persistence that continues to expand with each new discovery. Modern analysis of these sites increasingly suggests that what is being uncovered is not random residue, but structured remnants of repeated cycles of conflict that were never fully resolved at the material level, leaving behind physical traces that outlast the political and strategic frameworks that originally produced them. As these findings accumulate, they raise deeper questions about how much of early modern warfare remains physically unaccounted for, and whether the current archaeological record represents only a fraction of what once existed across centuries of continuous military activity. The implications of this extend beyond academic interpretation, touching on the broader realization that human history is not entirely contained within written documentation or preserved monuments, but is also embedded in the ground itself in ways that remain partially inaccessible. Even as modern technology improves the ability to detect and analyze subsurface anomalies, the sheer scale of historical layering across Europe suggests that many sites may never be fully excavated, leaving portions of this buried record permanently out of reach. This unresolved dimension introduces a subtle but persistent uncertainty into the study of early modern warfare, because it implies that the complete scope of past conflicts may never be fully reconstructed, only approximated through fragments that surface over time. In this context, each recovered cannon becomes not only a recovered artifact, but also a reminder of everything that has not yet been found, and everything that may no longer be recoverable due to changes in landscape, development, or natural erosion. The result is a form of historical awareness defined as much by absence as by presence, where understanding is shaped by gaps that cannot be filled with certainty. As the investigation of these sites continues into the present day, the enduring presence of these buried cannons leaves behind a final and unsettling question that remains unanswered beneath the surface of Europe. How much of its past still lies hidden, not waiting to be discovered in full, but existing permanently beyond the reach of complete understanding, silently extending the timeline of history into places where it can no longer be fully reconstructed?